Although I'm French speaking, I will make my presentation in English because I was asked to participate in an English speaking workshop. So, voilà. It won't be totally easy for me, given the fact that I wrote my text in French because I had no time to do it in English. So, my slides are in English, I hope in a good English. Don't hesitate to raise your hand if I use a non-proper word and if you don't understand me. I will speak from maybe a strange point of view, being a criminologist. And I'm not speaking from the point of view of, I don't know, a geographer or a pure sociologist. So my presentation will focus on electronic monitoring and prison as a mean to ask the question, to address the question of the association between the identification of mobility and liberty and freedom. Excuse me. So freedom is, from a long time ago, from Hobbes, seen as the absence of obstacles to mobility. And today we can still consider that we are quite instinctively thinking of mobility as a freedom. But I think our relationship with mobility has changed, so we need to reconsider this identification, and this is what I will try to do from the point of view of prison and the evolution of the carceral system. Mobility, really briefly, and I'm really sorry because I will shift on a lot of concepts I use because I have 20 minutes and it would take 1 hour to really explain everything. But mobility really simply, for me, is just a spatial shift through time. I consider, as Frello, space-time and mobility as social constructions. It's not that mobility in itself doesn't exist. It's just that my point of view is a, I would say, constructivist one. I'm addressing the question of the social construction of space-time and mobility. I use the idea of space-time morphologies of Bertrand Montullet, which means that social constructions of time and space go together. And with one specific construction of space, you have one specific social construction of time. Space, in my opinion, can be physical or not. So when I speak of space and of mobility, it's not only physical space and physical mobility, it's also social, conceptual, and so on mobilities. We'll go back to this further. The hypothesis is the hypothesis of a shift in the social construction of space-time between two different morphologies. And I have here a discursive approach, which means that I'm not, in first instance, studying the practices, the real practices of prison, but the discourses about what prison is or should be. First morphology is the morphology we call with Bertrand Montullet the limit form, which means that space is ordered by circumscription. The basis is the border, which lines a specific space, and to this space corresponds a time of eras, which means that the border to exist needs a stability in time. And so if we have to think about borders, we have to think about stasis, a time when nothing moves until brutally the border moves in a rupture. Okay? What could be mobility in this context? It's what I call a crossing mobility. To be mobile is to cross a border. So to be mobile is going from an anchorage to another anchorage. And this has been shown by, amongst others, Zygmunt Bauman, who showed that in the modern times, the first characteristic of a man should be his anchorage in the society, in a place. And then his mobility is thought as something that separates two different anchorages. So we have to cross a border, cross a border between states, between blue colors and white colors, between two families in a marriage, and so on and so on. So in this conception, mobility is the ability to overcome an obstacle. So it's quite logical that mobility would be associated with liberty, because the border is what prevents you to be mobile. So when you are mobile, you are freed from this border. This classical prison, conceived in the 19th century, is a quite pure example of this way of seeing space and time. Because the prison is structured by clear walls, the outer walls, but also inner walls, because the prison separates each detainee from the others. And the prison is also a system of classification of detainees and so on. So the whole prison is conceived as little boxes, and the whole purpose is to prevent people from moving socially, but also physically. The time is a time of repetition and clear articulations. One day you enter the prison, and you know the day you will go out. And this day, it's just over. You've done your time, and that's it. No following, no anticipated liberation, nothing. It's what I call a painful immobilization. And there, mobility is release or escape, but nothing else. You will see that this has changed a lot. There's another morphology that I propose to you. It's the flow form one. There, the time is seen as a constant flow of time. In this conception, you cannot conceive a border, because if everything is always changing, you cannot have the stability to draw a border, to draw a limit that would be meaningful. So with this time, you have to conceive, to structure the space as a network. That's quite classical. The network adapts itself constantly and doesn't need the idea of border. So the question of the stasis and rupture is no question for a network. In this context, the mobility is a drifting mobility. What does this mean? It means that the mobility is constant, because in a network, your position depends on the relationships you have with other nodes of the network. Every node is also located in comparison with other nodes. So everything is constantly adapting, so you don't have any fixed position. You are not inside borders, you are just in relationships with different nodes, and this varies through time. The immobility in this context is almost impossible. It's always partial, and it's costly, because you have to make an effort to be in a stable relationship with other nodes. To this vision corresponds an ideology I will detail a little bit later, which I call mobilitarian ideology, which is the praise of mobility for itself. What could be the mobilitarian prison? In the material I use for my study is the Belgian Penitentiary Act, which have a very broad parliamentary documents, which develop a new vision of prison, a new attempt of legitimating this old institution we call prison. And in these discourses, not in the facts, but in the discourses, this prison is an open prison. People come and go, services from outside come in, the families, the friends, And also the inmates can go out for medical reason or to have lessons and so on. It's also a system of multiplicity of carceral spaces, because it is said clearly, prison has no exclusivity. Prison is just one space among others where you can serve your prison sentence. You can also serve it outside. You can serve it at home and under electronic monitoring, or you can serve it at home without electronic monitoring. All this is carceral. You are just serving your time. It's a time of monitoring, so it's not a question of the day you enter, the day you go out. It's a question of an evolution, a constant re-examination of what you should do, at which stage you are of your trajectory, and what are your possibilities at this time. So it's a very different way of just thinking what the prison is. In this context, you can find back the four imperatives of the mobilitarian ideology, which are activity. During your time, you are not just waiting on your bed, time to flow and say, yeah, in 1 year I will go out. You have to do things, do anything, but do something, and you will have to report, to justify yourself for your activity. This activity is not a question of obedience, it's a question of activation. You have to take initiatives, restorative justice, lessons, anything which could be a project for you. So when you enter the prison, you are asked to write a project, a detention plan, where you just define what you will do, what are the initiatives that you will take during your time. And when you're freed, it's the same. You have to make the plan of what you are going to do now that you go out. So it's a totally different logical than just enter the room, I lock the door, and then wait for 10 years. It's totally an opposite logic. Participation is really important because punishment is a collective project. You participate in your prison, and also a lot of different institutions participate in the organization of the prison punishment. So private and public institutions of different levels, of different powers in the federal state of Belgium, participate in making the prison a common project. And another imperative is the adaptation. Every punishment should be clearly adapted to the person who is concerned. So it's not the question of a standard punishment. Every 1 year in prison is just 1 year in prison. It's not the case anymore. It should not be the case anymore, in theory, because I'm studying discourses. And I can tell you that the institutions resist a lot to this logical. But the way they are conceiving prison is really different. In this context, electronic monitoring is a really interesting system because it shows it shows the same logic, but in a broader way, you know, because you stay at home, but for some schedules you have to go out. So you are and immobilized and mobilized. You are socially immobilized too, because the reason why you don't go to the prison is that the institution wants to prevent you from downgrading social mobility. So you are socially immobilized in your position, in your family, at your work, in your social network. But you are also more mobile than when you are in prison. So it's not quite a system of immobilization or mobilization. It's just a system of mobility monitoring. It's just a system that tries to cope with different spaces and tries to monitor your mobility and immobility in those different spaces. So this is a really different way of thinking about mobility and freedom, I think. I think that these examples, which are quite specific, but I think they are a good example of other dispositives, social dispositives, is a coexistence of mobilizations and immobilizations. And you can no longer just say it's a question of mobility or a question of immobility. It's a question of both. And it's a question not of the fact that mobility or immobility would be freedom. It's not the fact that in the old times to be mobile was to be free, but now that we are demanded to be mobile, freedom is immobility. It's not this. I don't see things this way. It's a question of mobility constraints. And it's also a question of monitoring rather than stasis and ruptures, which means that it's a question of trajectories. In multiple spaces, interlocking mobilities happen and immobilities. And the system, here the repressive system, tries to have a power on all your mobilities and immobilities. So it's a question of re-evaluation, constant re-evaluation. And if you see the dispositives, the question is not what did a judge say this day, what is the day of the end of your punishment. It's not this. That's a decision, but there are also other decisions, constant decisions and reports and different institutions that make inquiries and monitoring. And when you're at home with your under electronic monitoring, you can ask for a modification of your schedule. You can ask for an authorization to go to the hospital and so on. So we are not in an in and out system. So there, mobility as a freedom has no sense in this context. And people under electronic monitoring are now complaining about mobilities that they are obliged to have to develop. So we see that the way we thought prison is immobilization and electronic monitoring can only be good because, why? Because it's mobility. And if it's mobility, physical one, if it's mobility, it's freedom. If it's freedom, it's good. So we have to deconstruct this and enter a reflection about complex and personal relationships between mobility and freedom. So my title was Freed from Mobility, Freed by Mobility. I think it's both of them. We have to go from binary to complex approaches, from mechanical to ideological relationships between mobility and freedom, also from physical to multiple spaces, and take into account the fact that being physically mobile is not necessarily be free. And maybe a way of saying it in one sentence could be that freedom is, among others, the question of autonomous trajectories in multi-layered spaces. Well, I thank you.
Thank you very much.